All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for warm season vegetable gardening. My name is Aiden, and I am a librarian at Sunnyvale Public Library. We're pleased to welcome back the UC Master Gardeners of Santa Clara County for another informative talk full of practical tips. For those of you who don't know, the UC Master Gardeners is a volunteer organization sponsored by the University of California to make research-based gardening education accessible to the community. Volunteers complete a 60-hour training and are certified on a yearly basis. Our speaker today is Laura Monczynski. Laura has been a UC Master Gardener since 2001 and teaches a variety of gardening topics to both home gardeners and professionals in both English and Spanish. She has been certified as a master composter since 2001 and a green gardener since 2008. Laura has a 400 square foot vegetable garden, about 20 fruit trees, and plants tucked into containers wherever she can find a little space and sun. Today, Laura will discuss how to plant a garden to yield fresh vegetables all summer long. Topics included will include the basics of site selection, soil preparation, and planting and maintaining warm season crops such as tomatoes, peppers, beans, and squash. Laura will also discuss growing in containers and what to do about some of the pests you may encounter here in Santa Clara County.
Thank you very much, Aiden. And thank you, Diana, who is a master gardener, who is also assisting in the background. And thank you all for coming to join us on this beautiful afternoon when you might want to be out in the sun, kind of working your garden. But we'll talk about some of the things that you can be doing and when to do them. So this is what we're going to be covering today, the why of vegetable gardening. So some of you may not have started a vegetable garden ever, and you're kind of thinking about it, especially since we have so much water this year. It's a good time to start thinking about it. What to grow, where to grow it. So we'll talk about containers, raised beds, different places you can plant things, the location on your property that might be good or on your balcony. And then we'll get into the hows. So we'll talk about preparing your soil, preparing what you're going to plant, the actual planting of it and maintaining it to keep it going so it's going to produce well, because that's what we have it for, to produce and feed us. And then harvesting, telling when things are going to harvest. We will be talking later on about some of the more common vegetables that we grow here in Santa Clara County and what you're looking for with growing and harvesting them, and what some of the most common pests or diseases you might have. So we will be talking about some of the most common ones there. So there are breaks, and Aiden and Diana both have that, where we'll be stopping and taking questions. So as Ada mentioned, keep the chat for questions. We won't be answering questions in the chat. So if you're a master gardener on here, we're not going to be answering questions in chat. We'll be doing them live so that everybody can benefit from it. So benefits of growing your own food. So a lot of you probably have different reasons that you're growing your own food. If you have done so, or maybe you've just moved into a new place where you have more property or less property, or you got a community garden, and everybody has different reasons. One of the most common, of course, is it's fresh, nutritious, and delicious. So you can pick it right when it's at its peak. It's not picked early for shipping and storage. You can get it right there when it's got all the nutrients, and go pick it right before you're ready to eat it or cook it. And there's a song that says, there's nothing like love and homegrown tomatoes. A homegrown tomato right out of the garden, sometimes still warm from the sun, is just really delicious. So if you haven't had the experience of eating straight from your garden, I think you're going to enjoy doing that. It's also great to get children interested in vegetables. If they have a hand in growing it, if they pick it themselves, if they eat it when it's really full of flavor, as opposed to sitting on a shelf or in a truck for who knows how long, gives them a different appreciation for vegetables. I know I personally grew up with a father who had a large vegetable garden, and I would just stand out there and eat vegetables. So I love vegetables. I love vegetables even more than desserts. So part of it is that experience of fresh vegetables right out of the garden. You can grow all different varieties if you grow them yourselves. I don't know how many of you recognize what's in this pot if you look closely. These are carrots. We think of carrots as orange because mostly that's what we see in the store are orange carrots. But if you grow them yourself, you can grow all different varieties. It's thought that the original carrots were purple, and then when the Dutch started developing, the royal house was a house of orange, so they did orange. I don't know if that's true, but that's kind of the story. But there are all these different colors available, so it's a lot of fun when you can do it yourself. And if you're planting them, it's a lot easier to find purple seeds than it is to find purple carrots in the store. Also, if you have young children and you give them a purple carrot, they're going to think that's fun and more likely to eat it. We do now have more varieties available with farmers markets than we traditionally have in grocery stores. But if you're getting the seeds yourself, especially, or sometimes at the nursery, you can get a lot more varieties. And it really opens up flavor possibilities that you might not have thought of before or experienced before, and makes it even more enjoyable to eat the vegetables and impressing other people with it too. One of the reasons I do it is I like to eat organic food. So if I grow it in my own garden, I know what went in it. I know what was in the soil because I do my own composting. I know what went into the compost because I put it in. So this is an important reason for me. It's not important for everybody, but this is one of the main reasons that I like to grow my own vegetables and fruit. Better for the environment to walk out in your backyard and pick it as opposed to driving to the grocery store to get it, or however you might get to the store. I tend to bicycle, but if you're driving to the store to get it. But also, on average, our food comes from 1,500 miles away. So there is a lot of fuel, a lot of oil used in getting the food that far, because we have sort of gotten spoiled here eating off season. A lot of people, they want what they want when they want it. And so if it's off the local season, it's going to be shipped from far away, shipped from Mexico, shipped from Chile, shipped from China. And so there's that environmental cost from that. Whereas if you grow it in your own garden and keep it right on the property, you cut out a lot of that. Fun, right? Bragging rights. We have had on and off at our Master Gardener meetings what we call a brag table, where people bring in unusual things they grow, or things that went a little bit awry, or things that are really big. And it's just fun to do that. And then sharing. So this is a lot of us who are master gardeners, we like to share our love for garden, but we also like to share our produce. And so we have potlucks where we make produce. Also, sorry about the picture. I'm not sure what happened here with this, but you can kind of get the gist. Those are tomatoes in the center of the table. They're some odd colors right now, but those are tomatoes. Sharing them with friends and neighbors, coworkers make you popular in the neighborhood, for one thing. And if you accidentally grow too much and you don't want to waste it, you have a lot of people to share it with. Sometimes food banks can use the extra produce. And there are organizations like Village Harvest on the peninsula that will come and glean your fruit trees or whatever and take some of your excess and take it to a food bank. And then there is the sharing it with wildlife, which is not something that we all like to do, but a lot of these critters were here first, not all of them. Some of them were imported. And you do have to take into account that you might lose some to the animals or find ways to protect it. So you can, as things are ripening, put some kind of cover, some kind of cage around to keep animals from getting in. There are limits. I don't mind sharing a little bit with the wildlife, but there are limits to what I like to share. And I'm sure there are for you too. It's more fun to share with friends, neighbors, and coworkers. How do you decide what to grow? what vegetables, what varieties, and how many. I remember my father once saying that neighbors should get together and say, okay, I'm going to grow the tomatoes, you grow the zucchini, you grow, so that we don't have everybody having too much of the same thing. And that's common to overplan, at least in the beginning, until you figure out is going to work for you, how much you're going to eat or process for later eating. One thing that Master Gardener specializes in is vegetables that grow well in this area, and fruit and other plants. But we're talking about vegetable gardening right now. We have research gardens throughout the county in various climates. Palo Alto climate's a little bit different than San Jose climate. We used to have one up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We had them in different parts of the county because we are a state program, Master Gardeners, through the University of California, but every county has a little bit different climate, maybe a little bit different soil. We do experiments to see what plants grow best in this environment, what tastes the best. There are some varieties that may grow well. For instance, San Francisco fog tomato may grow really well in San Francisco where it's cooler and foggier, but in San Jose, it might get too much sun and not do as well and not taste as good. So we do these experiments and come up with lists of what we think grow well. We used to have tastings open to the public. Maybe we'll do that again, but right now we do that internally. And we're looking for the varieties that grow well in this county. And on our website, which will be listed at the end too, there are lists of things that we think grow well in this area and that taste good. Taste, of course, being a bit subjective, but the texture, the flavor, there are some things you can say, well, this is a little sweeter, this is more acidic, and those are a little bit easier to measure. One thing that's tempting is to look at these seed catalogs and say, oh, that looks pretty, or, oh, that sounds really good. But you have to consider the region it's grown in, because that will make a difference. The minerals that are in the soil, the terroir, so to speak, that is more pronounced in wine, but you can still get some of that in vegetables, and they may grow differently in different soil. And then the amount of sun that they're going to get and the temperature will have an impact. Most important probably is, what do you like? You don't have to grow something because somebody else said it's good or because you think you should try it. Just grow what you like, especially what you're going to want to eat a lot of, and you want to have the convenience of going right out into your balcony or right out into your backyard and getting it. So it doesn't just have to be good for you. It can be something that tastes good to you. What can you eat and how much can you eat? Everybody knows about zucchini and people trying to give away zucchini because they grew too much. But I am always happy to have extra zucchini because I can do a lot of different things with it. I don't just eat it straight or saute it. I have things that I make, for instance, a zucchini burrito mix that I'll make, and I'll freeze portions of it. And then all throughout the winter, get that out, heat it up, wrap it up in a tortilla. People do canning. There are a lot of different things that you can do. So think in terms of not just what you would eat fresh or what your neighbors, friends, coworkers would eat, but also what you can preserve for later use. One example I have here is chilies. I love to grow all different kinds of chilies. In Master Gardeners, we have about 100 varieties that we grow each year. We have a spring garden fair, which we'll post the flyer for that later too, with all these different varieties. So I try maybe a dozen different varieties each year. And I'm not going to eat all of them fresh. Some of them I will cut up and freeze. Some of them I will prepare in foods and freeze. I make chili jam. and not with just straight hot chilies, because that would be a little bit too much, but I mix some hot chilies and some more mild chilies. We do, Master Gardeners, we did put together a chili cookbook, which will probably be available at our Spring Garden Fair on the 15th coming up, or in our office. And those are used for their cooking, making salsas. I also like to make chili powder to use throughout the year. I don't make it all at once, because once it's ground up, like any spice, it will start to lose flavor. So I just dry some of it and we'll ground portions of it at a time. So I'm eating chilies all year round in different forms. Also herbs, kind of connected with vegetables. You can grow herbs in your garden and dry them and use them, especially the kinds of herbs that you only get small amounts in the store and are very expensive. Why not grow them yourself? They don't take up a whole lot of room, and you can do that. Also canning and preserving, freezing, various ways to do it. Fermented foods are really popular in the past few years. So that's another thing that you can do with your produce. So all different ways that you can do it. So think about not just what you eat fresh, but the things that you buy in stores in jars or cans or in the frozen food section. And maybe you can do that in your own garden. Availability of it. This is something that is really getting a lot better. I used to be able to find, for instance, only orange carrots. Now, if you go to a farmer's market, you may find purple carrots and white carrots and yellow carrots. So there's more availability than there used to be, but you're not going to find that in the supermarket if that's where you shop. Maybe in Whole Foods or some kind of specialty, a little bit higher end market, you're going to be able to find that a little bit that focuses more on healthier foods. I remember telling me once that he grew arugula because that's hard to find in stores. Really easy to grow, reseeds itself. Once you start going, you might get 4 batches in 1 year, and very easy to grow, but harder to find. So that really made me think about what I'm going to grow in my garden, as opposed to what going out and buying it in the store or trying to find it. And those things that are less common tend to be more expensive. I mentioned growing all different chilies. So there are some chilies that are very easy to find and very cheap, especially at specialty markets, Mexican stores, some Asian stores. But there are a lot of different varieties that are going to be hard to find and expensive if you do those. So instead of growing jalapenos, grow ají amarillo or some less common one. Cost at the market. So this was what I mentioned about peppers. So jalapenos can be really cheap. You can get a whole bunch of them really inexpensively. Or you can grow a more exotic, rare type of chili in your garden. It really doesn't cost probably anything different in your garden. The seeds probably cost the same amount, or the plants probably cost the same amount. You're still using the same amount of soil amendment and water, but so there's not a difference in growing them for price, but buying them for price is. So that's something that you might consider if that's a concern. And space. How much do you have space for? Those of us who are serious gardeners can pretty much always find a little extra space somewhere. We have one master gardener who grows plants on the diving board of her swimming pool. So if you are really determined, you'd be surprised at the space you can find. Here's somebody growing in a median, or I think this is on campus at UC, just right in the middle of a sidewalk, take out a little section and grow that. We do, though, tend to have smaller yards here in the Bay Area. So we don't have a whole lot of space. So we want to utilize that really well. One of the best things that I have found for doing that is vertical gardening. when I grow things like cucumbers, for example, instead of letting them sprawl on the ground and taking up a lot of ground space, I train them up trellises or wire fencing that I'll put up a row of wire fencing and train them up there. And that way they only take up a very small amount of ground space instead of several feet. So I save space, can get more in a small space. Plus, there's the advantage of the fruit not lying on the ground or the vegetables not lying in the ground, where there are a lot of little bugs and insects that like to come up from the soil where it's nice and moist and chew on them. So it helps with pest management also. Containers is another way that you can increase your space. If you have hardscape, maybe you have a concrete back patio, but that's where you get lots of sun, go ahead and grow in containers there. We'll talk about sun being an important consideration. With containers, you can grow places where you don't have ground and expand the amount of space that can be devoted to growing food or something else. Containers also can be put on wheels, or if they're small and light, be moved around to get to the sun. You might have sun in one area in the morning, but it's not enough to give enough photosynthesis and ripen things well. And maybe at lunchtime you go and move it to another area, and you can take more advantage of sun, even though you don't have a lot of space that's in sun one day. Containers are really great for that. Community gardens too. If you don't have enough room on your own property, get a space in a community garden. There are a lot of them all throughout the county. San Jose itself, where I am, has about 20. A lot of community gardens, they don't cost a lot. There is a charge because not only are you using space, but water tends to be a more of a concern, and that's affects the price more. That's another way you can do it. If you have a balcony, if you're in an apartment or a condo, you might have a southern facing balcony. That's one way to do that, or east or west, as long as it gets a little bit of sun, you can grow a lot there. There's something called bio-intensive gardening, or square foot gardening is another name, where you can grow a whole lot in a really small space. So there are lots of books about it. We're going through the library here, so I kind of like to promote books. One of them is John Jeavons, Jeavons is the author, and he's connected with Common Ground in Palo Alto. And he wrote a book called How to Grow More Vegetables in Less Space in Your Mountain, something like that. That's not the whole title. It's easier to find by the author. And a lot about how you can fit things in a small space. You want enough room that roots can go down and not compete too much, but there are ways that you can grow things together. You can do things like grow lettuce and then in between do bigger plants. And lettuce does better in the cool season. By the time it's getting a little warm for lettuce, the other bigger plants will be growing up. You can take out the lettuce, so you've kind of double used that space for a while, overlapping seasons a bit. So that's another way that you can get space. If anybody has any creative ideas, we can share those later. And then water requirements. Seems like a funny thing to talk about now when we've been getting so much water. For several years, this was one of the bigger issues. And when I talked about some of you may be gardening for the first time, that's been for many years the concern that I've been hearing for people not growing a vegetable garden, wanting to, but not growing because they were concerned about water use. And that's certainly a legitimate concern. In the bigger picture, you use less water growing it yourself than if it's grown commercially or even in a small farm. When you grow it yourself, you can water at the right time, at the right space. We'll talk a little bit about irrigation, but lots of times when you're out in the community, you'll see in the fields outside of towns, you'll see overhead sprinklers in the middle of the day with the sun and wind taking away the water, you can lose, when you're overhead watering like that during the day, you can lose up to 90% of the water to evaporation. It doesn't even get to the soil and the roots and into the plant. If you're doing it yourself, you can make sure you're watering right to the root zone and you're not wasting all that space. Plus, when I'm growing stuff in my garden, I might just rinse off the dust a little bit. If I'm buying something from a store, I'm going to wash it more thoroughly because I don't really know how clean it is and how much it's been handled. So I'm going to use more water that way. Plus, if you go to the grocery store, you see them misting. If you go through the produce section every 10, 15 minutes, they'll mist it. So they need to try to keep it moist while it's waiting there for somebody to come along and buy it. So if you're growing it yourself, it's estimated that you're using 1/4 to 1/8 of the amount of water as if you bought that produce. So there actually is a big water savings growing it yourself, as long as you're watering appropriately. However, that's not on your water bill. The other overuse and wasting of water, it is on your bill. And that's something that's been a concern as we've been restricted because of drought, concerns about going over, having to pay extra, being fined, possibly having the water turned off. This year, not so much. In the Mercury News today, it talked about Gavin Newsom starting to loosen some of the water restrictions, not too much, because drought is a way of life now. We've had one good year here, but we can't count on that. It's a dry area with a lot of people in it, and they kind of outpace the resources. So it's something that we need to be careful of. This year, though, is really good. This is something, so I do grow my own vegetables, but in terms of water requirements, I do consider that when I'm deciding what to grow. A couple of years ago, when we had a lot of drought, I was growing butternut squash because I love butternut squash. I love to make soup with it. I like to roast it, like to do different things. And I was also growing zucchini. I was getting zucchini from those plants almost every day. And I was giving them about the same amount of water as a butternut squash. The butternut squash, I had a few different plants, and I got 6 butternut squash for the entire season. So I did not get nearly as much to eat for the amount of water that I put in. So I decided, okay, the next year, I'm not going to grow butternut squash. I'm just going to grow things that yield a lot without extra water. I have grown watermelon in the past, but I figure that's called watermelon for a reason. So I haven't grown that the past few years. Now I would feel comfortable doing that. So this year, I'd feel comfortable growing most anything. But I did leave this in here because who knows what next year is going to bring, or the following year. Location. Oh, so let me, before I go on, are there any questions about what we've discussed so far, about decisions about growing vegetables, why to grow vegetables, what to grow, how to figure out what to grow?
So far, there aren't questions on that topic, but I do have to apologize to the audience. Earlier, we had the chat disabled by mistake. If you were trying to put something into the chat before, I apologize. You can put the questions in right now. And if you prefer to ask questions by voice, then we'll have a section for that at the end. But to keep everything organized, we're going to do the majority of them through the chat. So let's give folks just a little bit of time to put their questions in there.
Okay, I see 9 things in chat, but they're not questions. There's something else.
They're questions for topics that I believe you're going to get to later. But
Okay, okay, terrific.
Mhm.
Yeah, it makes it easier on Aiden and Diana to keep the questions on the current topics. They'll try to save those for later.
Okay, I think this question is okay. We'll do this question now, and you can let us know if you're going to get to this later. Could you
Okay.
list summer vegetables that are easy to grow?
Okay, yes, we will get to that later. I had
Okay.
mentioned in the first slide, I had the picture of tomatoes. I always tell people, if you're going to grow one thing, grow tomatoes, because that's where there's the biggest difference between homegrown and store bought. And tomatoes are pretty easy to grow. They do have some pest and disease problems, and we'll talk about that at the end, but that's one of the most popular ones that people grow. Squashes are good, beans are good. Eggplants and chilies are in the same family as tomatoes. And we have a list also that we'll be sharing of the different vegetables that grow well in Santa Clara County and when is the best time to plant them.
Okay, I think all the questions coming in are ones that we're going to get to later. They're not so much about reasons for planting summer gardens. So why don't you go ahead, Laura, and everyone who put questions in the chat, we will ask these when Laura gets to the topic that they're related to, okay?
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. Location, just like real estate, location, location, location. The most important thing to consider in location is sun for the vegetables themselves. For you, you might be concerned about how close to the kitchen it is or some other convenience factor for you. And those are important. And the soil is important. There are a lot of things that are important. For the plant itself, sun is the most important. It needs some root space, some good soil nutrients. Different vegetables need different amounts of sun. And this is one thing to consider. One thing that I always talk about with growing plants, whether it's in your garden or whether it's in your house plants, is consider where it came from initially. And that will tell you what its native requirements are, what it did well in. If it's something that grows in the desert, it's not going to want a lot of water and it's going to need a lot of sun. If it's something that grows in a rainforest, it's going to have different requirements. A lot of our vegetables came from elsewhere. Some of the things we grow as annuals or perennials in their native climate, like chilies. And you can keep a chili growing for several years if you protect it from the cold because it's not used to that. So knowing its native conditions will give you an idea of what conditions you can give it to give it the best chance of success. Lots of times we'll grow things that are just not adapted to our climate at all. And we can do it, but there's a lot more input of maybe extra water or time or amending the soil or whatever it is. But you can do it. It's just a matter of knowing what to do. There are vegetables that are from warmer climates initially, and they do well with a long growing season and lots of sun. So chilies, tomatoes, melons are some of the more common ones that really need a lot of sun. And when we say full sun, you've heard partial sun, full shade. Full sun means 6 to 8 hours of sun a day. So most summer vegetables, if you can get them 6 to 8 hours of sun a day, that's really great. You can do that by planting them in a sunny location. You can do that by having them in a container. You can move around. There are other ways you can get a little bit extra sun too. You can grow them against a light colored wall that will reflect sun back on them. Some people put reflective sort of foil-like mulch that reflects sun back up. There are different things you can do to make the plant think it's getting a little more sun, but the sun is what makes the plant photosynthesize the energy of the sun and create its own food. So plants are autotrophic. They make their own food using energy of the sun and other inputs, carbon dioxide, and kind of recombine them to make their food. That's why they need sun. Now that can be mimicked with artificial light. This picture on the bottom is an airport in Chicago, at Chicago O'Hare, and they're growing hydroponically, and you'll see really, really bright lights on them. So when we are growing things indoors, we want to put it in a sunny windowsill if it needs sun. That's usually not quite enough. Sometimes some artificial light will help, and there are lights that are designed for plants that will have the right spectrum to mimic the sun as much as possible. So I use lights when I am starting vegetables because I tend to start some of them indoors. Those plants like tomatoes and chilies that have a long growing season, if I start them indoors, I can get them bigger and kind of give them a head start before I go out and put them in the ground. And they'll have more time to ripen. Otherwise, if I'm starting them from seed in May or June, by the time they're mature enough to produce, it's already getting a little bit cooler, and the texture kind of becomes mealy as they get cooler. So sun is number one, and we don't always have a lot to say about that. Sometimes thinning trees above it so that you still have shade, but it'll let a little bit of light in. I had a neighbor who had moved out and rented the place, and all these kind of weed trees grew up, and then they moved back in, and I went over and I said, all these trees have come up and they're shading my garden. If you would be open to maybe cutting them down, I would help and I would share my vegetables. So that's what we did. He and I together with our chainsaws cut down a bunch of those trees, which were not the trees that they had planted. They were not the useful fruit trees that planted. I got more sun, he got more vegetables. It's a win-win. So being creative in terms of getting sun can help. Where do you plant? There are basically three places. You can put it right in the ground, you can put it in some kind of raised bed, or you can put it in a container. No right and wrong. A lot of it is there are advantages and disadvantages of both, and a lot of it is just what you have available to you. Growing in the ground, I like to grow a lot of my vegetables in the ground. It's already there. It's easier. That's kind of how I learned to grow them. There can be problems with pests, gophers. I've watched a plant shake and then disappear underground as a gopher pulled it under. But for the most part, I've done okay growing a lot of things in the ground. There are some things I don't. Santa Clara County, we have this clay soil, which is actually a good thing to start with. It's a little bit difficult to work. We need to amend it. I have a slide later. I'll talk a little bit more about soil. That's a common complaint is, oh, this hard clay soil. It is good to start with because it holds water and nutrients well. So it does have a lot of good advantages. Raised beds. This is probably the most common popular way to grow vegetables right now. One reason is you can control the soil that you put in there. If you just want to do a looser potting soil, maybe some compost, it's a little bit easier. It's easier on the body. You don't have to bend over as much. And you can do edges that you can sit on if that's what you want to do. Also, if you're making a raised bed, if you're doing it for the first time, we recommend putting hardware cloth underneath. So that's that 1/4 inch kind of screening. It's kind of like a screening with a bigger mesh. And that keeps critters from digging up from the bottom. So gophers, voles, those invertebrate or the vertebrate pests that will dig up. However, because you have those spaces, worms can still get up in there, and the good fungus and all those good things that you want, all the beneficial insects and the beneficial soil life can still get in there. So it's recommended that you put something under that allow, and it also allows moisture to get through. Also, if you're growing in raised beds, the soil warms up earlier in the spring. The times for planting are less dependent on the temperature of the air and more dependent on the temperature of the soil. We may have some nice sunny days and you think, oh, it's really great, but the soil hasn't warmed up yet. You put your plants in and the roots are cold and they don't really grow as much. Soil is an important consideration in terms of temperature. In those raised containers, they're getting sun from the top, they're getting sun from the sides, and they warm up earlier. So you can start your plants earlier in the spring. And then very raised beds. There's really not much limit. This is the Fresno County Master Gardeners have a demonstration garden called Garden of the Sun, and they have this wheelchair-friendly garden that you can roll right under. Containers. I use a lot of containers, even though I have this 400 square foot vegetable garden. It's not enough space for me. And I grow containers for a couple different reasons. One is I grow my tomatoes in containers because a common disease of tomatoes is verticillium wilt, which lives in the soil for a long time. If the plant gets infected and it gets in the soil and it's in my garden, I can't plant tomatoes or other vegetables of the same family, peppers, eggplants, potatoes, in that same place until the population of that pathogen goes down. So that's one reason I use soil for containers for tomatoes. Also, containers give you extra space because if you don't have a section of ground, this is a friend of mine who has hardscape where there's sun, where there's ground, there are those trees shading it. So he grows in containers there. Also, they can be portable, they can be decorative. You can have them indoors, you can have them on a balcony. The big difference with containers is you have to make sure you have really loose soil. I talked about the clay soil being good in the ground, holding on to water and nutrients well. You do want to amend it to make it easier to work with, to make it easier for the roots. But if you put that native soil in the container, especially if it dries out, it's really hard. It kind of becomes like concrete. So you want something in a container to be lighter and fluffier. So potting soil for growing in pots is really good. It makes it easier. So that's one thing that's different. Sometimes I'll put a little bit of native soil from the ground in just to stretch it a little bit, or in my tomatoes, I might put a little bit more in the bottom so the water doesn't drain through quite as quickly. But normally you want looser soil. And also there are plants that have very specific soil needs or preferences, like blueberries, which like more acidic soil, or carrots that need a looser soil so that the roots can go straight down and not get twisted by the hard soil or rocks. Even succulents like cactus, there are edible cactus plants, so I consider that a vegetable too. If you have something with specific soil needs, then you're only amending basically using special soil in a certain areas as opposed to a lot of it in your garden. Also, they need regular water and fertilizer. If you have plants in the ground, the roots can go really, really far, find extra water, find more nutrients, form beneficial relationships with some of the mycorrhizae fungi, a fungus that will help supply more nutrients from further away. So in your garden, if it's in the ground, your plant can put roots down and find more. But in a container, what's in there is all it has access to. So once it uses up the fertilizer, it can't put roots out to find more. So you need to fertilize and water more regularly. In terms of how often, part of it is getting to know your plants. So in a container, depending on the size, you might be watering once or twice a week. You might be watering every day. It also depends whether it's in the sun or the shade, how much you water. And fertilizer, whatever it is you're growing, there's fertilizers for very specific plant families, different nutritional needs. Follow the label. More is not better with fertilizer, so don't put more in than what it's needed. But the labels will tell you how much to put and how frequently, maybe every 2 weeks, maybe every month, depending on what you're growing, what the nutrients are. And with vegetables, we're having to add more nutrients because we're taking away a lot of the nutrients when we eat the vegetables, as opposed to a bush that might just keep everything pretty much right in there. Soil. Our soil is mostly referred to as clay soil. People closer to the coast might have sandy soil. There may be some of you on here who are not in Santa Clara County who have different soils, but this is geared towards Santa Clara County, and we mostly have the clay soil. When we talk about clay soil, silty soil, sandy soil, it's the exact same thing, the exact same components. It's the size of the mineral particles. So soil, we don't really think of it, and we think of it as being solid, but it's actually about half air space, pore space for air and water. And only half of it is solid. In a good soil, it can get compacted, all sorts of things can happen, but in a really good soil. So almost half of that is mineral. So of the whole soil, 45% is mineral. The size of those mineral particles are what determine whether it's clay, silt, or sand soil. So clay soil, you can see in that top middle picture, is really, really tiny. So if a clay particle were the size of a penny, sand particle might be the size of a house. So it's a really big difference in size. So you can see that there's more surface area per particle, and that's why it can hold more water and nutrients. Also with the electrical charge, that's another way. You can see also that it could get easily compacted because of those small particle sizes and small space in between them. With clay soil, you want to be careful about not working it when it's wet, not walking on it when it's wet, because it can easily get compacted. That's something that you want to be careful with. On the upper right, there's a chart. You've probably seen it in gardening textbooks, the different blends of soil, because you don't have anything that's 100% clay. You usually have some kind of mix of soil. And you don't change. So this is soil texture. So there's two things. There's soil texture and soil structure. The texture is what it's made of, whether it's mostly sand, silt, clay, mineral particles. That refers to the texture. That really you can't change. You can amend it, but amending it would be with a potting soil or a planting mix or compost. You don't want to take clay and add sand particles to it. You can't get enough in there to make a difference, and you can end up more cement than loose soil. The structure of the soil, on the other hand, is how it's held together. That you can change. Easier to change for the worse than for the better. You can change it by walking on it, compacting it. You can change it by using chemicals and losing the soil life. And the soil life will help keep the soil aerated. You have worms that will dig around and make tunnels and help get air down to the roots. So those are all good things. So you don't want to lose that. This picture on the bottom, this was a class we did for the professional gardeners where we were looking at the drainage for the different types of soil. So on the left is clay soil, the middle is silty, and the right is sandy soil. So we had 3 people pour water in, the same amount of water at the same rate, and watch how it went through. So you see the clay soil is holding on to that water for longer, which means it holds on to the nutrients longer too, because the nutrients are kind of carried by the water. But you also see the puddle on top. It can run off quickly too. So you want to water more slowly to clay soil to give it time to soak in with those small particles and the small spaces in between them. On the far right, you can see the sandy soil. It just goes right through water and nutrients. So somewhere in between. So if you have soil in the extreme, amending it with compost or some lighter mixture will give you something more in the middle where you've got some drainage, because you need drainage. So it doesn't, your roots aren't sitting in water, but it stays in there long enough so the plant has time to drink it. How do you improve your soil? Compost is one of the best things for improving your soil. It takes a clay soil and makes it lighter, fluffier because of the texture. You have more space in between, so you're improving the structure that way. Also, if you have sandy soil and you put compost in and you mix it in, you've got something to hold on to the water instead of draining through. It also helps neutralize the pH. So plants have different ranges in which they do well with pH. You've probably heard about blueberries, azaleas, rhododendrons doing well with more acidic soil. Vegetables do well with more neutral soil. And the reason for that is nutrients are taken up differently at different pH levels. If a soil is alkaline, and our soil in Santa Clara County tends to be a little on the alkaline side. So there are some nutrients that the plant has trouble taking up in that more alkaline soil. Adding some compost will bring it closer to neutral. That most vegetables do well in the 5.5 to 7 pH range. And you can get little soil testing result tests at a nursery, like in chemistry class, where you have the litmus strip that you put in and get an idea. There are all different ways that different levels of checking that. And you can also send your soil out to a lab. And we have on our Master Gardener website a list of soil labs that you can send soil to get some better ideas for how to what nutrients your soil needs. If it has toxins in it, gets some ideas for how to do that. Another way people improve their soil is by cover crops. If you ever go to a community garden in the winter, you see a lot of fava beans. The reason for that is there are some plants, for instance, plants in the legume family, peas, beans, fava beans are an example of that. There are clovers, buckwheats, plants that pull nitrogen from the air and have little nodules on their roots and will improve the nitrogen level in the soil. Nitrogen is something that, because it has those different forms, can be lost easily. So that's one of the nutrients we need to add most. So if you grow cover crops, that will pull nitrogen into the soil. Also, you can chop those up and either mix them in with your soil, make sure it's moist so they can work down, or add that to the compost bin, and that will add nitrogen. They have maximum nitrogen when they just start to flower. If you wait until they put out the fruit, until they put out the bean pods, that's where the nitrogen is going, because that's how it reproduces from those seeds in there. And that's the plant's reason for being. We have other reasons for planting stuff, for beauty, for eating, but the plant's reason for being is to reproduce itself. So once it starts reproducing, the energy goes into that. So the maximum time is when it's first in flower. I tend to, when I plant fava beans, I do about half for the garden and half for myself. So I do like to eat some, but some of them I will, when they're about 50% flowered, chop them up at that time, mix them into the soil, or do the compost. So that's another way you can improve your soil while keeping it from being bare in the winter, so you don't have soil running off, you don't have erosion. You have something to support the beneficial life in your soil, like worms, beneficial fungus, and bacteria, rather than leaving it bare, unless you're planting winter vegetables or cool season vegetables. So a lot of you are doing that. I like to compost. I have about half a dozen compost bins, a couple worm bins. So I put my food scraps, my yard scraps in the compost. We do have, through the University of California, free composting classes. So you can look that up on our website, or go to recycle.org, or put in Santa Clara County composting. And we have free 2-hour composting classes on Saturdays or in the evenings, if you want to do that and make your own compost and know what's in there. You can buy compost too. Irrigation, so watering. Of course, the rain has been doing a lot of that this year. So if you've got fruit trees, or you have perennial vegetables, or you've been planting cool season vegetables, you're not really having to irrigate a lot, finally. But once the summer comes, you will have to irrigate more. Very popular right now are drip emitters, because they will water just to the plant root. So you can set one up for each plant, or however you're growing stuff, and not be wasting water to overhead watering, or a part of the garden where there's not a lot. When we're watering, what we're doing is we want to water to the root system. We don't want it going all over where there aren't any roots. We don't want to put so much water that it's percolating down below where the roots are. We also don't want to be putting so little that it doesn't get to the roots. Sometimes people will water just a little bit. They may have their sprinklers for 5 minutes a day. Well, it just waters the surface, it dries out. You need to get down to where the roots are. Different plants have different root zones. Normally smaller plants have smaller root zones. Lettuce won't go down nearly as far as tomatoes, which are a bigger plant. And you can find online or in books like the John Jeavons book I mentioned, charts that show how deep the roots go to most of those. So you want to water long enough that it gets down to where the roots are. Otherwise, the roots aren't getting enough water and you'll have too many roots right at the surface where the water is. And then the sun will come out and dry those and overheat the roots. So you want to make sure to root far enough down. Soaker hoses can be good if you have a row of something small like lettuce or mâche, which is M-A-C-H-E. It's a French green that's very, very small. So you're not going to have a drip emitter to each plant, but soaker hoses can be good when you have something in a row. Hand watering can also be beneficial. Now, this is not really a good picture because it's overhead waterings and getting a lot of water on the foliage. You don't really want to do that because if the leaves stay wet, you can get more fungal diseases. Wet and warm, a lot of diseases spread that way. So you want to kind of hold the hose down. So these are kind of dram heads or one kind of watering head. And you can have it on a wand so you can hold it down and get it close to the roots. One advantage of hand watering is that you're out observing the garden. So observation is a really important part of gardening. If you have something on automatic and maybe you're busy, you don't get out there for 2 weeks, and then you come and some pest has decimated your crops, it's going to be a little bit late to save all of it. Maybe you can at that point, but if you're out there every day or every couple of days watering, you're seeing what's going on. So if something is coming up, you will see that. Make sure when you're observing too that you look on the undersides of leaves. A lot of pests are hidden on the undersides of leaves, so you can't always see it from the top. And I like to hand water just because I enjoy being out in my garden. That's my relaxation place. So that's a reason I like watering. You do want to make sure to water regularly. Don't let things really dry out and then flood them. There are some plant problems. Blossom end rot, which I have a slide of later, is something that comes from irregular watering. It really stresses the plant to get really dry and really wet. And also it makes it harder to pull up the nutrients on a regular basis to keep the supply of nutrients that the plant needs. And think of us, we kind of eat and drink regularly throughout the day. We don't drink all at once and then get to where we're parched. Early morning is the most efficient time to water. It gives time for the water to soak in before the sun comes and dries it out. But it doesn't sit on foliage longer, especially if you're watering in the evening and you get the leaves a little bit wet and that sits overnight, that can contribute to a lot of disease. If you water during the middle of the day, you're going to lose a lot to evaporation. Again, with the overhead watering, you can lose as much as 90% of water to evaporation. So if you water early in the morning, you're not losing all of that to evaporation. Give it a little time to soak in, but not to sit too long for the plants or stay wet too long. And a lot of how you irrigate is personal preference. And a lot of this, there aren't right or wrong. There are pros and cons, and there's personal preference. There's your convenience. Maybe you're not home during the day to be able to hand water, especially at certain times of the year. So you really have to do what works best for you. There's no right and wrong. And then the source of your plants. So this is one slide that I like to show, growing your own. So for $4, you can go buy zucchini for dinner and make a dish for dinner. Or you can go to the nursery and buy a plant for $4. And then you've got zucchini a couple times a week. Or you can buy a pack of seeds and have a whole big row of zucchini feed yourself, your family, your freezer, your canning jars, and your neighbors. So all for the same amount. So if that's something that you're concerned about, take that into account. Now, I like to grow from seed, not just because it saves money, but because I like to see something come up from seed. And I'm going to be talking about growing from seed, growing from transplants, and then planting directly in the garden as opposed to starting from seedlings indoors, or greenhouses, which is one of the ways I do it. So I do want to stop here and ask for questions.
Okay, so we're going to go way back because a few people had questions about raised bed planters. You talked
Okay.
a bit about the pros of raised bed planters, but are there any vegetables that require deep ground soil instead?
I don't think that there are any that require the ground soil. I think that, well, two things. One is that the roots can go deeper if they're not inhibited by the hardware cloth or whatever. Vegetables that need a lot of root space, like watermelons or tomatoes that go really deep, they can do fine in raised beds, and there are definitely reasons to do it. I do mine in containers, as I mentioned, because of diseases, but things that have bigger roots. Also, anything that originated in this soil. I mentioned cactus. So the prickly pear cactus, Opuntia, I grow, and I eat the pads and I eat the fruit. So that's a vegetable for me. It's native to these clay soils, so it's not going to do well in amended soil. So I wouldn't do that in a raised bed. But most of the vegetables we would be planting would do fine. The only advantage is if it needs that hard clay soil or if it really needs more root space.
Okay, you talked about using hardware cloth underneath the raised beds. If somebody already has a raised bed without hardware cloth, is there something that they can uh, do instead now?
If they have it one with or without, I'm sorry.
Without.
If they have without, what can you do now? um, you can't really get more under there unless you dig all the soil out and put it down and put it in. You may be able to, with individual plants, plant them in gopher cages. So it won't protect the whole bed, but if you've got something like a tomato plant, there are cages that have that kind of hardware cloth. And some of the roots will get out and could be, but that will protect most of the root ball. Those would be the only things I could suggest.
Do raised beds have any problems with getting hotter during the height of summer?
Um, they do get warmer, so yes, if you have something that's really sensitive to that heat. But if you have something that's really sensitive to the heat, you wouldn't be growing it necessarily in the summer. You would be growing it more in the cool season. There are a lot of vegetables that we can grow year round, but they do better in the cool season. Broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, and all the greens, spinach, bok choy, lettuce, all of those do better with cooler. So they get stressed by the heat. And then if they were in a raised bed, that would be additional heat. It would be additional stress on them. They would go to seed earlier and maybe turn bitter earlier.
All right, thank you. Now moving on to soil. How useful do you think having the right soil sensor can be?
Very useful. The soil is really the foundation of everything. I remember reading a book by Amy Stewart, who wrote several gardening books, and one of them talked about starting a soil garden in Santa Cruz and not understanding the soil. She'd go to a nursery and, oh, that looks pretty, and she'd put it in her soil, which, being close to the coast, was sandy and didn't do very well. My takeaway from that book, she talked about, if you have $1 to spend in your garden, spend 90 cents in the soil. If you have good, healthy soil, it's going to make it easy for everything to grow. And if the plants have good soil, good nutrients, they're just, and they're going to grow well, they're going to produce more, and they're going to have fewer problems with pests and diseases.
I think the question was specifically about soil sensors, if you have any opinions on those.
I think that probably means, sorry, I was just told to plug in my computer for power. And my husband's computer, mine wasn't working, so I went to his. I'm sorry, give me just a second to get plugged in here. So I think the sensors you're probably talking about are for water. To measure the moisture content. So there are a few different things. There's a very simple $8-10 sensor. I don't have one right here that has on the top, it's this plastic green, and it has a gauge that will go dry, moist, wet, and it's just on a continuum. And it goes down about 8 or 10 inches into the soil, and there's a probe at the bottom of it. It's really important when you do that to measure the soil, not just at the surface, but down where the roots are. So as it goes down, you can see that moisture meter moving and see, okay, it's wet here, but then it gets dry after a couple inches and it stays dry. A very inexpensive way to do it. And it works okay. I use those. Then there are tensiometers. You can buy something for $100 that uses more pressure than specific wetness to measure it. So there's a whole range of things. So, the more expensive, fancier ones tend to do a little bit more because they measure the soil moisture a different way. It's really helpful. You can also use your finger to put that down, and that's free. You already have that. But the more you can find out about your soil and take better care of it, the more success you'll have with plants.
Thank you. Next question is, what is the purpose of rototilling?
Rototilling. That's a really good question. That's an important question. Rototilling is good when you are first starting a garden. If you've just moved into a home, or for instance, when I bought my house 35 years ago, I had a back deck and a side deck. I didn't need them both. I took out the side deck, and so nothing had been done with that soil for many years. And I rototilled it to loosen it up and mix in amendments. I bought a couple cubic yards of soil and looser soil and mix that in. So it can be great for breaking up really hard soil. Maybe it was compacted because of construction, or it was a play area or something like that, and mixing amendments in. It's really great for starting a space. It's not something that you want to do every year. We really emphasize minimal disturbing of the soil, because you get this whole soil food web that develops there, this whole ecosystem under the ground. And you have beneficial fungus, you have worms, you have all sorts of good things. And when you rototill, you chop that up and you break up that good fungus, and the mycorrhizal fungi. What they will do is they will connect with the roots of the plant, and they will get sugars from the plant, and in turn they will give more nutrients to the plant. Those are really a great beneficial help with the plant. And you can buy soil amendments and fertilizers that have that in, and they have these really long threads that can go hundreds of yards. And you don't want to chop that up and lose that for the plant, or chop up the beneficial life. So that's one reason for not rototilling a lot. Another reason is different organisms live at different levels in the soil. There are organisms that live close to the surface that need a lot of oxygen. There are ones further down that really don't, that need those denser conditions. When you rototill it, you mix that up, and those organisms, beneficial organisms, are now in an environment that's not good for them, and you'll lose a lot of them. So we don't recommend it on a regular basis. And then the last thing it does is they tend to go down to the same amount, let's say 10 inches. And so if you do it every year, you are hitting about 10 inches down. So what's up there will be mixed up, but then you'll develop a hard pan underneath that will make it hard for water to go down through, to drain down through, and for roots to go through. So you're kind of developing a hard pan. Not good to do regularly, but really, yes, a good thing to do when you're starting a garden for the first time. Another thing that people do is double digging is another way that you can get down deep to loosen stuff up. In a case like that, you kind of start with a trench and then you do another one and you move over the soil more at the same level than going down. You can dig deep down, but you're not changing the level as much. So good to do initially, not good to do on an annual basis.
Okay, this next question. Do you have recommendations for basic soil mixes? This person says, I mix organic raised bed soil with Miracle Glow with chicken manure. Do you have any advice?
Those are all good things. I think compost is the best because it's already broken down. Chicken manure is wonderful to use. I used to have chickens and I use chicken manure, but I more likely put it in my compost and let it break down, because if something has very high nitrogen, it can be hot and burn, especially tender young plants. So manures are usually best if they're composted first, or if they're put on an area that you're leaving fallow for a while, that you're not planting, and give time for maybe the winter rains and the worms and whatever else to work it down in. Those are all good things to put, but you don't want to put too much in. I know Miracle Grow now makes organic planting mixes, so I'm assuming that's what you're talking about as opposed to chemical fertilizer. I'm going to talk about fertilizer, but with fertilizers and soils, the more organic amendments you put in, the more that supports the soil food life, so you get this sustainable ecosystem. Whereas if you're adding something that's chemicals and it kills that soil food life, you have to keep adding more nutrients or chemicals that you're not getting naturally. I say experiment with different blends. So some native soil, some compost, some amendment like a manure can be really good. You want manure from herbivores, not from meat-eating animals, because they can share some of the same pathogens. You also want to be careful with manures that it's not from animals that are taking a lot of deworming medication or hormones or antibiotics that can affect your soil. But the more organic you can get, the more you'll sustainable system you'll get, the less work you need to do. If you're doing it in a container, it doesn't matter that much. We can't really recommend different brands of soil, but I would say look for things that are organic. And one thing that's good too about gardening is, especially if you're doing vegetable gardening, mostly annual, you can just experiment. If it doesn't really work, change it a little bit for next year. You don't really lose that much. You might not produce as much maybe, but one of my favorite gardening phrases is there's always next year. And I like experimenting. So if it works for you, great.
Okay, there are a couple of questions that refer to Sunnyvale Compost or Sunnyvale Compost Center. I think this is referring to the Smart Station, the Smart Station Recycling Center. Are you familiar with the compost from there, and do you have advice for how best to apply it?
Well, I actually toured there with a composting program, and they have the yard waste. They also chip up pallets and various things to put in there. It's okay. I don't live in those cities. I'm in San Jose, so I don't live in the cities where I have access to that. It's okay. Some people have said that they still have pieces. You can still see pieces of wood or whatever it was originally. You want it all the way broken down so you don't see pieces. So sometimes people will compost it a little bit longer or screen it through to get any pieces that haven't broken down yet. It's not bad. It's not great. It's not necessarily organic, which is what I like to put on my vegetables. On places where I have ornamentals, I'm less concerned about it. It's free if you live there. And I think the only caveat is I would maybe compost a little further and screen it. And it's okay. It's great that they're doing that.
In vegetable boxes, do you recommend putting mulch or straw on top of the soil?
Yes, yes. Mulch does, or straw does a few different things. It holds in moisture, which is good. It keeps the temperature from fluctuating too much when the heat hits it and then the sun goes away. It keeps weeds from sprouting up. So it does a lot of good things. With summer vegetables, we usually recommend waiting just a little bit till the soil warms up enough. Because if you cover it, it's like covering with a blanket, and the soil won't have a lot of time to warm up. So I might wait till July to put it on there until the soil's good and warm, and then do that.
If we prepare soil with compost and amendments, and then it rains, do we have to worry about it washing away?
No, because you want it down where the roots are, so that's a good thing. I mean, if the soil is really dry and you have a lot of runoff, like if it's hard clay soil and it's the first rain of the year, but normally what that does is it helps it carry down through the soil, through those pore spaces to the roots where the roots are. So that's actually a good thing. Some people will mix in. So when we do compost, there are a few different ways to do it. One is to mix it into the soil, but then you're disturbing the soil, as we mentioned, the soil food web. When I'm planting something, transplanting something, I put compost in the planting hole, and that's one of the ways I do it. Initially, my garden, I amended it and mixed it in, and then I put it in the planting hole. And the planting holes are going to be in slightly different places every year. So it will get the whole garden eventually. And then I also put it on top and let the worms take it down, or let the rain take it down. And that's one place it will be beneficial. So if you put it on and it rains, that's actually good.
Okay, we have a few more questions there about soil in containers, but you did have another talk that was specifically about container gardening. So do you want to take those questions, or would you like to continue and circle back later if we have time?
Let me just do a couple, if you could kind of summarize them.
Sure. Is there any point to using cover crops in pots?
Oh, that's a good question. um, sure. I mean, it doesn't hurt, but there's not really much need to do it because it's such a small amount of soil. You could grow cover crops in there and you could mix it in. You'll get a little more nitrogen. That'll be fine. You could grow it and eat them, or you could grow it and put it in your compost. You don't lose anything by doing it. And you will get more nitrogen in there.
How do you how do you keep soil fertile year to year? And when you replace soil, what do you do with the old soil?
Oh, good question. The time I replace soil is if I have something in a container and the plant had a disease. I will replace that soil. So I'll take all that soil out and I'll either put it in the garbage or I will put it in something that is not susceptible to that. I mentioned I have 23 15-gallon pots that I put tomatoes in. If they get a soil-borne disease like verticillium wilt, I don't want to plant in that same soil next year. I could wait a few years, but I want to use that. So I have citrus trees in half wine barrels. So I will put the soil on those and they're not susceptible to that same disease, or I'll throw it away. And then I will clean out the pot with a 10% bleach solution, 1 part bleach to 9 parts water. So 10%. That's the only time I throw soil away. But I add compost every year to my soil, or you can add a potting soil or a planting mix that has a lot of nutrients in them. Some of them come and they say that they have chicken manure and all sorts seaweed, all sorts of nutrients in there. So just add. And for instance, in my containers where it's a more specific amount, I probably replace a third of the soil every year. Even though I'm not throwing it away, I'll take some out, or maybe some went through the drain holes, and I will replace a third of it in a container. And that I've been doing that for many years, and that seems to be enough, either with compost or some kind of nutrient rich potting soil or planting mix. In my garden, out in the garden, when I'm transplanting, I'm adding compost and a organic fertilizer and maybe a little soil in the planting hole, which changes every year. So I'm getting that. And then I put compost on the top and let that work down in. So I am adding to my soil twice a year that's in the ground, in the spring and in the fall, in between the cool season and the warm season. And then just putting it on whenever I have enough, I just go ahead and add more compost. So it's an ongoing thing. you don't fix your soil and then it's done. But every time I plant a new season's crop, I amend the soil a little bit.
Okay, I think the rest of these questions are actually repeats. So Laura, why don't you go on ahead?
Laura, there was
Yes.
a question, somebody was planting in pure compost.
No, that's really too much, too much of a good thing. And it's too loose and it doesn't have other soil with the minerals that really holds on well. So to me, it'd be like taking a whole bottle of vitamins. It's really more than you need. Usually about 15% compost is what is recommended of the soil, that 15% of it be compost. That would be the ideal on that. So I'm going to move on. If there are other questions, we can do those later on. Talk about different ways to start plants. One way is from seed. So you get a lot more varieties from seed. It takes longer to do that, so you have to start a little bit earlier to get them in the ground. I find it a very satisfying way. I like to do it kind of like baking from scratch. You're planting from seed. Supplies that you might need, you don't necessarily need all of those, but you need some containers if you're starting them indoors or in a greenhouse or in a smaller container. I like to start my plants earlier for two reasons. One is I can extend the growing season and start them earlier for the things that need a lot of heat, like tomatoes and chilies that I might start in February. The other reason I like to start them in containers and then plant them up to bigger containers before putting them in the ground is the plant itself is bigger and stronger and more resistant to pests. One year I planted lettuce 4 times and it's young and tender and close to the ground, it gets eaten. If you can get the plant a little bigger and stronger and up off the ground on a stem, you have a better chance. So that's another reason I like to do it. You can use just about anything for containers. You can use milk cartons, you can use yogurt containers, not the kind that are angled like that or you won't get the plant. You can get pots, you can reuse them. Sometimes if I see somebody, gardeners at a shopping center planting annuals, I'll ask if I can have the pots. They're happy to give them to you because then they don't have to take them to the dump, and I'll clean them out with that 10% bleach solution because I don't know where they've been. So a lot of different things. You can make your own out of newspaper. There are even forms you can buy to wrap the newspaper around, but you can use anything. But you need to make sure that anything you use has drainage holes in the bottom. You don't want the water to stay in and rot the roots and get anaerobic conditions and maybe smelly. If you're doing them indoors, you want a tray under them so that you don't have water running all over the floor. And then some kind of potting soil. There are seed starting mixes. You don't generally need those, just as long as it's a light soil. The seed starting mixes you might use for something that's really, really picky and really difficult to start from seed. I have used it for celery, which is not difficult to start. It just takes a long time. It takes 21 days to germinate, whereas most plants germinate within a week. So I think people give up on them quickly, but once you get them going, they reseed themselves forever and they come up all over. Some of the bird chilies, some chilies that go through the intestinal tract of a bird that has an enzyme that helps break down the coat. Some of those things that maybe are a little more delicate, you can use a seed starting mix. But for the most part, just any light potting soil you don't have to spend extra for those. Generally a little bit of heat, because you're trying to mimic the conditions. These are things that grew in tropical areas where there was already some heat. Some people will just put them higher up. It used to be you put them on top of the refrigerator, but refrigerators are efficient. They don't lose heat through the top anymore, but it is warmer at the top of a room. So they'll get more heat there, maybe in a window, maybe near a heating vent, or you can buy heating mats. I also used an old waterbed heater that I had. But a lot of things need just a little bit extra heat. Make sure you label things when you plant them. You think you'll remember what they are, but you don't always. And you can decide what you want to put on the label. If you just want to put the variety, if you want to put the seed company, if you want to put the date, that's up to you. And then light, because in nature, if they were outside, they would have sunlight. So you want to mimic sunlight. I have these lights, and there are plant lights that are sold, fluorescent lights for plants that have the right wavelength. What I do is I have light, these are just regular shop lights, fluorescent lights, and I alternate cool, warm. So I get a fuller spectrum without spending the extra for the shop lights. It's worked for me for many years. And you want to keep the lights, you want it adjustable so that you can keep them about 2.5 inches above the top of the plant. If the light source is too far away, the plant will get really leggy searching for the light, and it may flop over or just not be a strong plant. So you want light pretty close to it. Read the directions. They will tell you how far apart to put them, how deep to plant them. If you plant them really close and then you thin them out, how to thin them. If you have too many plants and you want to thin them, don't pull them out by the root. Take a little pair of scissors and cut them at ground level, because if you pull them out by the root, those roots are going to be intertwined with other roots and do damage to the roots of the ones that are staying behind. You can do it, it'll work, but it's an extra stress for the plant. And there's also a lot of information on there about when you can expect them to show up, when you can expect to eat from them. You start out with the pots. You want to make sure they're clean. If you don't know what was in there, 10% bleach solution will kill most pathogens. I have found it's easier to moisten the soil first, because if I put it in the container and then I try to water it, it really takes a long time for it to absorb, and a lot of it will flow through. So what I will do is take the potting soil, put it in a bucket overnight with water, and then it's nice and pre-wet. So I'm not losing a lot through, and I'm not having the seeds wash away when I'm trying to give enough water. So I have found that works well to do it in advance. Pack it down just a little bit so there's not too much air holes in there. You don't want to compact it, but if it's not packed down a little bit, when you water it, the air holes will take it down, and then your seeds will be down too far. If you don't have the packet directions, usually you would plant 2 to 3 times the diameter of the seed. Different seeds are different sizes, and the seed has in there this little plant. You can see in the beam where the whole inside is showing. It has the embryo of the plant actually in there. So you can see the little roots, you can see the little leaves, and the rest of that is food to feed it until it can get up and break the surface and then start photosynthesizing and making its own food. The bigger the seed, the more food, stored food it has in there, so it can make it up higher before it breaks the surface into the sun and be able to see. So really small seeds you need to plant near the surface, because otherwise they will use up their energy before they get up into the sun. I put something over the seed. You can either push it down in or put the seed on and put the appropriate amount of soil over. Vermiculite is something I use, and I think that's in the next picture. Yeah, this is vermiculite. And it's very lightweight, so it makes it easier for them to pop up. You want to keep the soil uniformly moist until they germinate, because if the seed starts to open up, and the water helps break the seed coat down, if it starts to open up and then it dries out, it's really going to die. It doesn't have a whole plant's worth of moisture to sustain it. So you want to keep it uniformly moist. If you're not there watering all the time, just put some plastic over it, like plastic wrap, and maybe poke some holes in it. Once you see the plants start to come up, take the wrap off so it doesn't mold in there. And then, ta-da, germination. This is the exciting part for me, when the plants start to come up. Sometimes you'll see one of them still has the seed coat on there. I don't take them off. I don't help the plant along, because I want this plant to be strong enough to get that off. If it's not strong enough, the plant's probably not going to do well. So I want to make sure it's strong enough to be able to do that itself. Sometimes you always plant more seeds than the plants you want, because you're never going to have 100% germination. If I want one plant per container, I might put 2 seeds if they're new. If they're older seeds can last a long time if they're stored away from heat and light and moisture. They can last a long time. They have the year that they're made for stamped on the packet, but they will last longer if they're stored well. But the longer they last, the lower the germination rate. So you're going to put more seeds per container. The lights on once they start to germinate. You don't need lights before that, but once they start to germinate, then you need to help them with the photosynthesis. And they're ready to transplant after they get the first true leaves. So the first set of leaves that come out are the ones that are inside that seed. They don't photosynthesize the next set. And lots of times you can see these have a little bit different shape. Then they can photosynthesize, create their own food, and they can be transplanted anytime after that. The bigger and stronger they are before they transplant, the better chance they're going to have. And you don't necessarily have to transplant them once. I might start something in a 4-inch pot, and then when it gets a little bigger, if the outside is still too cold, the soil's still too cold, I'll put it in a 1-gallon pot, and then eventually put it in the ground or the raised bed or the larger container. And you want to gradually get them used to whatever conditions they're going to be in. So if you've started them indoors and then all of a sudden you put them outdoors, you've changed too many things at once. You've changed the amount of light you get, they change the amount of wind they get, the temperature they get, and it's going to be a shock to them. So if I've started them indoors, I might put them out for an hour, and then the next day a couple hours, and then gradually get them used to being outdoors. Maybe not in direct sun yet, gradually introduce them to direct sun, and maybe wait a little bit before I put them out overnight if it's still cool at night. Same thing as if you buy plants from nurseries and you buy it from the nursery where it had a shade cloth on it and the temperature is different, and you come home and you put it right in the ground right away. It's a lot of change right away. So sometimes people will come and they'll put it right next to where they want to plant it for a week, let it get used to the conditions, and then put it in the ground. Transplanting it. Once you transplant it, it will have access to bigger space, more room for the roots to go, access to more nutrients, probably more sun. The picture on the right, you can see the difference in the ones that were transplanted, how much bigger they are, how much greener they are. The picture on the left, these are Peruvian purple peppers. Those were all planted at the same time from seed. The one that stayed in the small container stayed small. It didn't have room to spread out for the roots to grow and then be able to pull up more nutrients, make a bigger plant. Transplanted into a 1-gallon, it has a little bit more room. When it starts out, grow that. You don't want to start it in the big one right away because you'll get too much water in the container for what it can take up. So you want to gradually plant it up. When you transplant it, do it at the same depth that it was in the container. If you plant it too deep, it will, the crown, the part of the stem is underground, that can cause some rotting. The only difference is tomatoes, because they will grow more. They have these little kind of hairs on the stem, and they will grow more roots from that. maybe peppers, but other than that, plant them at the same depth. Then you can also start from transplant. And so you can skip all those insights and start them right from transplant. So you can go to a nursery. We at Master Gardeners, and I think Diana's going to put a link or a brochure in the chat. We plant thousands of seedlings, chilies, peppers, a whole lot of other vegetables, some herbs, and even some ornamentals. And we have a spring garden fair, we're calling it this year. And it's going to be April 15th in San Jose from 9 to 2 at Marshall Cottle Park. So you can buy these seedlings that were started in our greenhouses using our scientifically proven University of California methods. There will also be vendors there with other garden related items and some other plants, food trucks, the whole bit. But she'll post on there. So you can do that. You can get something at the nursery. We focus on varieties that are hard to find at the nurseries. We don't want to compete with nurseries, but we want to keep these different varieties alive. We want to introduce people to these different varieties and give more options. And this is actually a fundraiser for our program that pays for the equipment for us to be able to do these classes. So that's just one source. The nurseries tend to have not as many varieties, and they have them earlier. You don't necessarily want to get them earlier when it's not time to put them in the ground, unless you're going to be up-potting them, putting them into bigger pots, and that's fine. You're looking for plants that look healthy. You don't want tall, leggy ones that might fall over. You want kind of short and stocky, because that means it had enough sunlight. It didn't go getting tall, searching for sunlight. And you can kind of lift it out and make sure it's not too root bound. You don't want the roots circling each other or having outgrown the container. And you want good firm roots. You don't want them mushy from too much water. So you can just kind of check it out before you grow it. I'm going to stop here for some questions on growing plants, starting plants.
Okay, there was also a question about the program about the recording. So yes, this is being recorded and it will be sent out to everybody who registered probably sometime next week. You won't get answers in email for any questions we don't get to, but towards the end of the program, I'll share a link for how to get customized help from the Master Gardeners of Santa Clara County. So those links that I share at the end will be great for if you have a very specific question that we won't have time for in the group. So starting plants from seed. First question, a few people asked this. Is it too late to start summer crops from seed right now, especially crops like tomatoes?
No, it's not too late at all. It's still March. It's not too late at all. I'm going to have here, and Diana, maybe you can post it now if it's ready. There's a chart that we have on our website that has recommended times to start plants, both from seed and from transplant. So it has the months that are really good, months that might work. It's not too late at all. March is really the best overall time to start summer vegetables. So even tomatoes and chilies, yeah, maybe if you'd had an extra month, you get them sooner, but still plenty of time. So no, you can plant them now.
What about green beans? When would you start those from seed?
I'd start them now or next month, or maybe even a little bit later, because green beans, they'll grow and produce really fast, but green beans have a bigger seed. So I start those right in the soil. In fact, I think the next slide, yeah, direct seeding. So for large seeds and root vegetables, large seeds will kind of be bigger, stronger plants and have bigger roots. And then root vegetables, you know, if it grows from the seed and you disturb the root transplanting it, you're going to have kind of a deformed, not as healthy vegetable. And so some of the ones that I would plant right in the ground, I'd wait till April. It's hard because this is a weird year. It's cool, it's colder, it's wetter. It's a little bit of a weird year, but April or May would be the time I would put things directly from seed directly in the ground. But I will be posting that chart, which will have information on all of these.
And for those of you looking at the chat, you'll notice that Diana has posted the vegetable planting chart there just now.
Excellent.
Somebody has asked their experience with starting plants from seed is about 50%. Is it true that some seeds may not be good? If so, how does one tell?
If the seeds have been around for a long time, they're not going to be good. If as good, you're going to get lower germination rates if they weren't stored well. Also, if you go to a nursery and they have the seeds outdoors sitting in the sun, I don't buy those seeds because they may have already had the conditions that start the seed. So some of them would have already started that process and then died because they didn't have the conditions that they needed. You can do germination tests where you put a bunch on a wet paper towel and see how much germinates. I just put them in the ground and I see, but I just, if I'm not sure, I put extra in. You can't necessarily tell looking at them. It's just knowing the conditions under which they were stored.
Do you have thoughts on using Costco rotisserie chicken containers as a small greenhouse for vegetable seeds in mini pots?
That's fine. That's fine. I believe in reusing things, and it's a nice good size, and I think that's perfectly fine. Just make sure you poke holes in the bottom for drainage. And wash out the the chicken grease.
So I'm going to repost the link here. It looks like it didn't go through. Okay, I think you should be able to see it now. All right, the next question is, I always end up overwatering seeds and losing the seedlings because I'm so afraid of not keeping them moist enough. Do you have strategies for avoiding this?
I think if you're starting the seedlings and you cover, you put the water in and then you cover it with plastic and poke holes, you're not going to be adding water all the time. And if too much is coming through the bottom or the container, pick up the container. And if it's too heavy, it's got a lot of water in, if it's draining out, those are ways to tell that you're getting too much water. And then using some kind of soil moisture meter if it's already in the soil. But yes, probably it's estimated that 85% of plant problems are water related, and more likely it's too much love, too much water. So that's common.
Do seeds planted in peat starter pellets need to be replanted in a larger pot?
Yes, because the pellet is not going to give enough root space.
This asker planted seedlings under a grow light and noticed the leaves were burning. Is that common? Is that indicative of too much light?
I've never heard of the leaves burning unless they're actually touching the light. I mentioned keeping the light about 2 inches above the seedling. So if it's touching the light, it could burn it. Sometimes leaves get look burnt around the edges if there's too much salt from commercial fertilizers or commercial planting soils. That can make it look burnt, but I can't imagine it being from the light unless it's actually touching, or if it's incandescent, which would be a hotter light. So we use fluorescent lights or specific plant grow lights.
Can you grow pole beans in containers? Is it okay to transplant them?
Grow what in containers?
Pole beans.
Pole beans in containers. Yes, a big enough container. I plant citrus trees in half wine barrels. So if you have a big enough container, sure. As long as you have enough root space. If it doesn't have the ideal amount of root space, it just won't grow as big, but it'll be okay. So Aiden, I'm going to move on.
Okay.
And then we can come back to more questions.
Sure.
So labeling, whether it's starting it from seed or in the ground, make sure that you do label it. You can put whatever information you want on it, or you can make a chart or keep a journal that has all that information so that you know what was successful so that you can replicate it next year. If there are plants that need support, like we mentioned just now, pole beans, or tomatoes that need support, put it in early. Put it in before the plants start growing up, because if you're trying to wrestle it in, you're going to break some off. You can do some damage putting it in. So if you know it's going to need some support, do it right in the beginning. I mentioned waiting until the plants are a little bit bigger and stronger before putting them in. Also, you can protect with maybe a row cover. This will let in about 85% of the sun, but will keep a lot of pests from alighting on the plants and eating them or laying eggs. Just another way to cover them when they're tender and young. They're really easy to eat when they're tender and young. So once they've gotten bigger, you don't have to do quite as much. And water it regularly. And we talked about the moisture meter. On the left is the tensiometer that I mentioned. And you're trying to get water to the root zone, not running off, not too much below, not where there are no roots. So as the plant grows bigger, it's going to need more water because there are more roots to take up water and nutrients with it. What we're doing is replacing the amount that we've lost. So the plant loses water through evaporation and then transpiration. So the pores at the bottoms of the leaves are where the moisture escapes from. So we're just, the amount of water we're giving is supposed to just be replacing what the plant lost. And you want to keep it at about 50% wet, not, I mean, there'll be a little bit more when you water, a little bit less right before, but don't let it get to those extremes. Sometimes a plant will trick you. There are some plants that have those pore spaces, which are called stomata on the bottom of the leaves, are large and they'll close up. They have guard cells on the sides that will close up when the conditions are too dry or hot to try to hold that moisture in. So it will look like it's wilted. And so people are going to want to add more water. Well, check the soil and see if it really is wet. So this is a plant that I just left. I did not water it at all. And you'll notice in the evening it perked back up. So some of those squash and those big leaf ones can trick you. They look wilted, but make sure that it's the soil moisture that you're checking. Fertilizing, because we're taking parts of the plant away, and if you're using organic fertilizer, you're feeding the soil, which gives you that long-term sustainable. If you're using a chemical fertilizer manufactured, it's going to give the nutrients to the plant it needs, and the plant will do well. The plant doesn't care where the nutrients came from. It's the soil and the life in the soil. So if you are using a synthetic fertilizer, it's kind of like a drug you have to keep giving to the plant, as opposed to organic, which feeds all that soil life, and you don't have to do it as frequently, and it will keep it producing the plant. So on a fertilizer package, you always see these three numbers, NPK. N is for nitrogen, and that's where most of the green growth comes from, and that's the one we tend to have to replace more often. So cover crops are one way to add that, as in addition to fertilizer. Phosphorus is for fruits and roots, and so a tomato might have a little bit higher amount. It might have 573. It'll have a little bit more phosphorus to do fruit. Lots of times people talk about their tomato plant is really big and beautiful, but it's not producing much fruit. They may be putting too much nitrogen as opposed to phosphorus. So lots of fertilizers will have what plants they're ideal for. And then potassium is overall strength. Somebody had already asked about mulching. So to moderate the soil temperature, keep weeds from coming in, holding in moisture, but maybe waiting until the soil warms up a little bit, because it'll be harder to warm up once it has this blanket on. And controlling weeds. Weeds will come up wherever. And as you know, the weed is kind of a subjective definition. This picture on the right is purslane, which some people call a weed. I love it. It's delicious. It's high in antioxidants. I remember being in my community garden at Story and King in San Jose, and people were pulling out the purslane and putting it in the compost pile. And then I walked across the street to the Mexican market, and they were selling it in the produce section for 50 cents a bunch. So it can be a subjective amount. But the main thing with weeds is get them before they go to seed, or one weed can become thousands. Controlling pests and diseases. So I recommend looking for another class because this is a whole class by itself. A strong jet of water takes care of a lot of things. Aphids, a lot of things will fall off. They'll won't be able to get up on the plants. They may be killed by the pressure of that. So that takes up a lot. Natural pest control, like ladybirds. The picture top middle, that's a larval form of a ladybug. A lot of people don't recognize that, but it actually does more aphids at that stage. I have the picture of the ivory soap, 99 and 44/100% pure. A lot of insects breathe through their skin. So if you use a little bit of vegetable oil or a little bit of dish detergent or soap in water, maybe a teaspoon to a tablespoon in a quart of water, that will coat the insects and they won't be able to breathe, and it doesn't do the same harm to your plants as a chemical might. Picture of a ladybug in various forms, so you can recognize the different stages. They do wonders in the garden. So this is the planting chart. So you can see March is the third column. So it says potatoes, radishes, spinach, summer squash. They meant next month. So this will give you some ideas. So you all have this, and it's on our website. Just real quick, a few different common things. So tomatoes, these are all different forms: classic, beefsteak, cherry, paste tomatoes, do different things with them. With tomatoes, there are so many different varieties. Make sure you know what color it's supposed to be when it's ripe. They're not all red when they're ripe. You might have a green zebra tomato. Don't wait for it to get red. It never will. It'll get a different shade of green. So being able to recognize those. Those you can transplant deep because they will grow more roots. So you see on the left, this was in a 1-gallon pot, and then I planted it in the 15-gallon pot. And you can see it created this whole new root. So it basically has twice as many roots. So it's going to get more nutrients and water and give a healthier plant. Tomatoes need a lot of support. They can grow pretty big. What's traditionally sold as tomato cages, those little kind of angled ones, are usually not strong enough. Texas tomato cages are. This is concrete reinforcing wire. These are some of the common problems. Verticillium wilt, which lives in the soil for many years. So if you had that on your plant, either get rid of that soil or plant something that's not from the same family. So if you plant tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, or potatoes, that pathogen is going to be really happy and keep producing. If you wait 3 years, the population will be low enough, you can go ahead and plant. Blossom end rot is another common one on the upper right that you see in tomatoes. It's a lack of calcium, but it's usually not lack of calcium in the soil. It's irregular watering that keeps the calcium from going through the plant and getting all the way to the end. That's why you get that at the end. Tomato hornworm can eat a lot of leaves very quickly. So just kind of keep an eye out for that. Usually it's the droppings below that are a clue that you have that. These are some of the most common things you'll see. Tomato russet mite, you'll see that damage from the ground, from the bottom up, whereas verticillium, it'll kind of be between the veins. Peppers, again, in the tomato family. So if you've had one of those diseases, you don't want to plant. This is how I dry my peppers. I bring the whole plant in and dry it like that, kind of keep the nutrients in there. Some of the things peppers get, sun scald is a common one if it doesn't have enough leaf cover. So I give them more nitrogen earlier in the season so they grow good leaves, and then more potassium later for the fruit. That's not a disease. It's not a problem. You just cut out that part. It just basically got sunburned. There are critters that will eat peppers. I find the hotter the pepper, the less problem with being eaten. Beans, another very common one. The thing with beans that's unique to, not really unique, but you really have to pick them regularly. because when the pods start to swell, those are seeds inside. And once the plant has produced mature seeds, it's finished its reason for living. It will stop producing. So pick those regularly for continued production so that they keep giving. Squash, summer squash, winter squash, both grown in the warm season. Winter squash just have a thicker skin, so you store them through the winter, but they're at the same time. Two common problems with squash is sometimes it will start to grow and then it will wilt and die after a few inches. It wasn't getting pollinated. Maybe there weren't enough bees. You can take the male flower and take a toothbrush or a Q-tip and pollinate the female one. The male flower does not have any fruit, so that's how you know what it is. The female one has the fruit attached to it. So if it's not getting pollinated, just when you see the male flowers, if nature's not doing its thing, you can help it along. Powdery mildew is a really common disease, but it's late in the season when you've probably had enough already. I take off the leaves as they get really infected, and by the time the plant's bad, it's kind of done anyway. And so hopefully you'll have good success and have a good harvest. We do have a few minutes left for questions, and I'll stay longer to answer more questions, but I want to be able to stop on time for those of you who have other things to do or you want to get out to your garden. So Aiden, are there more questions?
Yes, there are. And for those of you who do need to leave right at 3:30, I did put a link in the chat for garden help from the UC Master Gardeners of Santa Clara County. So there's a bunch of information on that webpage, and there's also a help desk where you can ask more specific questions that you're dealing with. Now, first question for this section, is it best to group vegetables with the same water requirements?
Yes. Vegetables or any plants. Yes, very important. Thank you.
How do you deter rodents such as squirrels?
Oh, man. I wish I knew. No, the squirrels went for my fruit more than my vegetables. He left my vegetables alone. One thing that can deter them is hot pepper. It won't deter birds because they're not sensitive to putting hot pepper around your plants. So sometimes some of my old ones, I'll do that. That's a good natural deterrent. Sometimes they'll kind of get used to it anyway. Putting some kind of cage or cloth around it. If there are openings, they'll get in. If you do trap, you need to know that it is illegal to relocate wildlife. So the law says you either have to release them on site or you have to dispatch of them with certain approved techniques. So maybe hire somebody to do it unless you're comfortable doing that yourself. But squirrels are hard. They're really hard. We have, if you look up UC IPM, so University of California Integrated Pest Management, there are pest notes on all sorts of things, on squirrels, on diseases, on insects, and you can also find them by plant. And if Diana can put the link in the chat, you can look up the plant and see things that are likely to affect the plant. But squirrels are definitely one of the more challenging ones. One time I tried planting sunflowers along the back fence, and that really worked because they would just eat the sunflower seeds and wouldn't come into the garden. But they're an ongoing challenge.
Do you prefer water-soluble or non-soluble fertilizer for vegetables?
I use water soluble because it's the water that will make it available to the plant. I'm not really sure what's meant by non-water soluble, but the nutrients travel with the water up into the plant. So I would say water soluble, but I'm not sure what the non-water soluble would be.
Okay, it is 3:30. But Laura, you said you could stay to take a few more questions?
Sure.
Okay,
sure, I can take it. But thank you everybody for coming.
Yeah, thank you everybody. Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
And I wish you much success with your vegetable garden this summer.
Thank you, everyone. We'll send out an email that has the recording for this as well as the links that we posted today. And if you were not able to work the chat, I wanted to give you an opportunity now to raise your hand, and then we'll see if we can take some questions verbally as well. We did get a bunch of questions about tomatoes. Or one person wanted to know, what does it mean that some vegetables are called nightshades? What do those vegetables have in common?
They're just a member of the same family. They're botanically similar. Solanaceae is another name for that family. They're just different characteristics of the chemical components in the plant.
Okay, and Hung, I'm going to allow you to speak.
Oh, so my question is, I have a cucumber seed that is 2020. If it germinates, will it perform as well as a seed from 2023? The same cucumber seed.
It could do perfectly fine. Usually the older it gets, the less likely to germinate, the less strength the plant might have, but 1 year shouldn't make a difference.
No, 3 years, it's 2020.
Yeah, a couple of years, if it germinates and it looks healthy, it could be fine, and maybe it was stored better and will even be better than the other ones. So as long as it germinates and starts growing well, it may be perfectly fine. It shouldn't lose very much over time. The really key is the initial germination. So I would just go for it. I think it's fine.
All right, and then there were a couple of people. This is going to be the last question. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question, but we're going to have more Master Gardener programs in the future. So just keep an eye either on their website or on the library's website and newsletter. There were a few people who wanted to know whether you should, how to rephrase this. If you're planting a lot of tomatoes close together, how can you optimize your success, or how far apart should you be planting those tomato plants?
On the seed packet, it will tell you exactly how far apart to plant it. Usually tomatoes would be 1.5 to 2 feet apart, would give enough room for the roots so that they're not competing too much for water and nutrients. If you plant them closer, they just may not produce as much, but they'll work.
All right, and that's our last question. Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you everyone for coming to this program today. And thank you also to Diana for helping to manage the questions on the back end. That was immensely helpful. All right, have a good afternoon, everyone.